Hello and welcome to Stretford Paddock. My name is Joe and this is a one-on-one interview. I am joined by sports broadcaster Ben Jacobs. Great to have you back on the channel, Ben. How are you doing?
Good to be back, and finally we've got some clarity to speak about, of sorts anyway.
Yeah, something has happened. Something has changed. There was a long time there where sort of nothing changed, but now something has changed, and that thing is that it looks as though board agreement pending. Jim Ratcliffe is set to buy 25% of Manchester United with potentially a view to a full sale or taking up more of the Glazers shares. We'll get into all of the specifics, but at least in terms of, I've got loads of questions for you, but just to start with, what do you make of this development? How likely did this seem to you, and are you surprised that we aren't seeing a full takeover and instead Jim Ratcliffe seems to have beaten out Sheikh Jassim's offer?
Not necessarily surprised. It was made clear by sources that Sir Jim Ratcliffe was flexible and in the last month or so had essentially changed his structure. So there was a bid that was discussed at board level that was seemingly dead in the water for just over 50% of the club, again with a staggered buyout to get to 69%, but it didn't benefit the minority shareholders and there was opposition. And instead of pushing that through, and let's not forget, the Glazers can do that because there's 6 of 12 of them on the board. And then the co-chairman, Joel and Avram, have a sort of deciding vote. But they chose to pivot, and Ratcliffe, now we've got a new structure that I think in all likelihood, but we have to wait for a bit more clarity, will have benefits to both the Glazers and also some at least of the minority shareholders. And as a consequence, there's less chance of any form of litigation. And Jim Ratcliffe is an expert negotiator, so we shouldn't be billing this as somebody that's coming to the table and because he desperately wants in at Manchester United is getting totally ripped off. I know that the Qatari brief may point us in that direction, and they, like some fans, will argue that he's coming in, he's not going to get any kind of instant legal control, he's paying over the odds, the Glazers still remain, it's a disaster for the football club, and Jim Ratcliffe is ultimately going to be scapegoated for that. And you can neatly outline that, but the Manchester United Supporters Trust in their statement, I think, were very wise in saying more clarity is needed before we can make up our minds. So my understanding is there's an agreement of principle at the time of recording for 25% of the club, and there is a rough valuation of 1.4 billion for that. And as a result, the parties can proceed, but there are still active negotiations over what the eventual path to control looks like, what instant sporting control looks like. And as a result, this may be fully voted on at the board meeting. It may be discussed at the board meeting. It may take a little bit more time still, but because Jassim has withdrawn, it does look like Sir Jim Ratcliffe is heading to victory. And I think the most important specific in all of this is the path to control. Yeah. When is it? And it can and often is two-way in a put and call agreement, which means that at one point and one price or one formula, I think it will be a variable formula, but it could technically be a fixed price. At one point, Ratcliffe will have the opportunity to buy more or the rest of the Glazers shares. And at another point in time, the Glazers will have the opportunity to cash out to Ratcliffe at different junctures and at different prices or formulas. So it really is very complicated. And the most important thing in this is that word option or obligation. Because if right now it was clear that come what may, there is an obligation for Ratcliffe to buy Manchester United Football Club either in full or all of the Glazers shares, I think Manchester United fans would be a little bit calmer. But if it's only an option, then there will naturally be scepticism as to whether Ratcliffe will buy more and whether the Glazers still actually want to go. So that path to control feels like the most important thing that will calm the Manchester United fan base. And we have to wait and see whether there is any clarity on that over the coming days or weeks.
Yeah, that is the crucial thing. I think, like you mentioned there, that statement from Must was pretty perfect, really, in that it sort of said, let's not judge things just yet. Let's actually find out exactly what this means, exactly how it means what it means, and like you said, whether the Glazers are going to be going or whether this is just, a step towards them getting a bit more money and keeping control. Let's just go back a little bit then. So I believe it was sort of Saturday, wasn't it, where we first started to hear, the news that Sheikh Jassim had pulled out of the race, having sort of apparently just recently put in a final bid for United that seemed to be rejected. Is that the case? And if so, what was that bid? And, why was it rejected by the Glazers?
There was no final bid. That's
Right.
my understanding.
Okay.
So it was a very carefully worded series of information from a variety of sources close to 9-2 Foundation in particular, but naturally we go to all sides. And the wording consistently from everyone I spoke to anyway was final and advanced negotiations, not new bid. Okay. And when clarified repeatedly and directly within those close to the Qatar camp, I was again told no sixth bid. So the fifth bid was the final bid. And since then, in the months that followed after April, there has been a consistent channel of communication. And we know that Qatar went direct to the Glazers as well as negotiated via Rain Group. And a return to those conversations happened last week, where 9-2 Foundation tried within their existing framework to get a breakthrough, and they couldn't. So you can read this two ways. One, they've pulled out because they've realized that Jassim is going to win. And I may have said it coming on here before, and I've certainly said this throughout the process. If Sheikh Jassim felt at any point he was not going to win, it was always more likely, sources had indicated, that he would walk away on his own terms rather than wait for a formal rejection. And I think essentially that is what's happened. So we can read the Qatar withdrawal as more than just a coincidence in terms of timing versus board meeting and versus Ratcliffe seemingly making significant progress and being on the cusp of victory. So that's one reason for the withdrawal. And then as far as the negotiations are concerned, I think that the actual valuation of the football club didn't really go up from the fifth bid over the course of the last 2 months, maybe by a little bit verbally, but not formally in any way, because as I say, my understanding is that a sixth bid wasn't made. The pledged investment increased from around 0.8 billion or $1 billion to 1.4 billion pounds or 1.7 US dollars, depending on what the conversion rate is. I always add the dollars, by the way, because the currency of this whole process is dollars. So every time you read something in pounds, we have to be very careful because the conversion rates can change slightly and it can confuse matters. Everything in terms of offer will always be in dollars in this process. So dollars will actually be the most accurate and consistent numbers to try and relay where possible. But anyway, regardless of that, I think that it's quite telling that suddenly this pledged investment, which was not part of the process, jumps up from just under £1 billion to almost exactly what 9-2 Foundation feel Ratcliffe is paying for his 25%. Because what they're basically saying is our bid on paper has debt cleared, has a similar club valuation to Ratcliffe. Yes, it's less, but they would argue not by much, and has a guaranteed binding pledged investment, which commits them to looking after the football club and the Glazers out and no new debt. And then conversely, you've got Ratcliffe, who is paying that amount that Qatar are committing to in pledged investment for 25% if he's successful, give or take. But where's that money going? And my sense is that, again, Qatar, in exiting the process, are trying to highlight that point and make it clear that on paper, they believe that their bid is simply better for club and community. Now, the counterpoint to that is those close to the process say that there is a gulf between the PR of Qatar and the reality of Qatar, which might explain why they've not been able to win. Because if the bid's that good, if it's double the market value of the club, if there's pledged investment, if there's no debt, then of course you can just argue the Glazers are incredibly greedy, but they're still ultimately potentially going to give a slice of the pie to Sir Jim Ratcliffe at a similar-ish club valuation. There is a difference, but you could still argue not such a significant difference to the point where Ratcliffe has blown Sheikh Jassim out of the water. It's higher, but it's not 8 billion, it's not 9 billion, it's not 10 billion. So obviously it's up to individuals to conclude, and most fans will listen to me and say, Qatar's great. We wanted Qatar to win. Qatar were perfect. Qatar were debt-free. And yet all of that on paper is there and sounds very appealing. But I think just for balance, it's worth pointing out that there are plenty on the selling side that have doubts as to whether 9-2 Foundation are actually who they say they are via a lot of these briefings that have come out during the process.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, the Qatar thing, because when we've spoken about it on this channel before, but it, like you said, on paper, everything seems perfect in terms of the bid and the money and the structure. But then you think, so why is Jim Ratcliffe outbidding them? Why? Like you said, it's only a small amount, or the overall value is only slightly higher from Jim Ratcliffe. But you'd think with all of this money available, all this planned pledging and getting rid of the debt and money available for a stadium and investments, you think maybe a couple $100 million more actually to the Glazers would have got this deal over the line. Were you? Two questions really. Firstly, was there ever any chance that Sheikh Jassim would have considered a similar structure to the Jim Ratcliffe one, where yes, there would be maybe an obligation to buy the entire club off them, but they could do it in certain instalments? Because we always heard this 100% thing, but why did they never consider sort of bending or being slightly more flexible financially and sort of mirroring Jim Ratcliffe's sort of structure? And secondly, why didn't they sort of bump their numbers up slightly higher then? If there was 8 billion available for this total package of players and infrastructure and this, why didn't they maybe take 300 million of that and put it towards actually, here you go, Glazers, can we have Manchester United? Because it seems like there's a lot of PR of, here's what you could have won, we were going to do all this stuff, but actually the money wasn't quite there to get the club in the first place. Yeah,
I think you make two very good points, and it's for fans to decide. And because it was the only bid for 100% and debt-free and the Glazers out, it's always going to be idealised. It's always going to be there in the background of what could have been. It might have been perceived differently if there were, like Chelsea, 5 or 6 bids for 100% of Manchester United. Then some would have had scrutiny over Qatar and said maybe that's not the best of the 6, but it was the only one for 100% of the club. So it's become the dream option because, as you say, on paper, there is a lot to like. And I think that Sheikh Jassim and the wider bid team, if they were successful, would have had a variety of ambitious plans, would have looked after the club, modernised it, invested in it. That's not to say that Ratcliffe won't, but when you have a bid that was that public throughout the process and promised so much that seemingly restores Manchester United to its glory, I think it's perfectly normal that fans are frustrated and they're pinning a lot of this on the Glazers. But again, we just need to be very clear. There's two sides to every story, and there may be elements within the Qatar bid that weren't quite what they said they were. And that is how the sellers or some on the selling side view the bid. And the reason for that is because Jassim wasn't heavily engaged in the process. It was all bankers and intermediaries. There were strange intermediaries. The first call, to tell you a little side story, came from an ex-government official. And those running the process, to my knowledge, were surprised and staggered. They thought it was a hoax. They couldn't believe who was calling them on behalf of this mysterious Qatar bid. And then as it materialized, everything was smoke and mirrors. And even now, I'm not sure that those running the process or even the Glazers are 100% positive who's really behind it. Is it a private individual and a Manchester United fan? Are there wider players at stake? And this is why the Glazers went to Nasser Al-Khelaifi, because they know him and they trust him. And they said, Nasser, if we're going to make any progress, can you consult? Can you be part of a meeting to see whether anything is possible? Even though Al-Khelaifi has always maintained that he's never been directly involved, and nor a QSI. But QIA, who Khelaifi sits on the board for, were definitely involved in pre-bidding consultations before it was determined that the vehicle was going to be 9-2 Foundation. So there's all manner of smoke and mirrors here. And I lived in Qatar for 5 years, so I'm very familiar with the politics and some of these groups. And what I can tell you from my time in Qatar is you don't do anything without Al Khalifi and the Emir's blessing in sport in Qatar. So it's quite a complicated structure. And we may never get clarity over that. In terms of why didn't they just take their $8 billion package and weight it so the Glazers got more, and at least in the short term, the pledged investment was less? I think that's a very valid point. Why not keep the pledged investment at the original almost £1 billion or $1 billion that you promised, and then take that difference when you upped it from $1 billion to $1.7 billion, and that extra $0.7 billion might have been the difference between taking something forwards and not. But I suppose, to be fair to Qatar, they would say, we've already offered double the market value of the club. We're clearing the debt, which Ratcliffe doesn't plan to do. We're buying 100% of the club. We're going to start with pledged investment that will cover stadium redevelopment and Carrington improvements, but then you've still got to deal with the men and the women's team and the academy and the building of the brand and everything else. So the pledged investment wouldn't have stopped at that number. That's just a starting point to almost get going. So eventually you hit a situation where maybe they just thought the money was so crazy, there was no business value, and it was never only a vanity project. And I think the other thing, which is why I prefaced it with that story I told you about the complications of Qatar, is this genuinely a Jassim Bid? And if it's only a Jassim Bid, and every time I've ever touched during the process on the wider picture, the government, any state ownership, any involvement from other players that haven't come out the woodwork, I've obviously got a fair amount of abuse because it's very neat. And Manchester United fans want to feel like we've got this rich, ambitious Manchester United fan. He's a private individual. Stop bringing politics into it. Stop bringing sports washing into it. That's absolutely fine. I empathize with anyone that has an opinion and I respect it. But if you believe that, and I'm not saying I do or don't, I'm just trying to present all sides, which I think is fair journalism. But if you believe that, then why would Jassim, like any other individual, including Ratcliffe, have a bottomless pit of money? So the stereotype of Qatar being rich and money growing on palm trees comes from the fact that it's the Emir down, it's QSI working on behalf of the government. But if it is just Jassim, then he's not going to have unlimited money. So eventually, once you get to 4 billion, 5 billion, 6 billion, and it's double the market value, and then it starts to push towards triple the market value of the football club, and you've got the pledged investment and you've got the debt and so on, maybe he genuinely just either didn't have that money or didn't want to pay the money. And I've made this point before, and it's funny because the natural reaction is for people to say, nonsense, of course he's rich, nonsense, of course he's bottomless, nonsense, of course he can find an extra $500 million. But why? We're not talking about pocket change during the course of searching down the back of the couch. We're talking about incremental increases that none of us will ever earn in a lifetime. So however rich anybody is, to start with your first offer, which I'm told was more like £3 billion, the indicative offer, not 4 billion, not 5 billion, £3 billion, and then to get up to 5 billion, which is twice the price, by the way, of Chelsea Football Club, and then be asked potentially to go to 6.5 billion. I think after a while, there's a fair argument, if this is just Jassim, a private individual, with or without family wealth, with or without his father's support, all of that's up for debate. I think there's an argument to say under that scenario, if you believe that scenario and it's Jassim operating alone, that maybe he did just decide to draw a line under it financially.
Yeah, I think under those parameters, I can agree with you. Just moving on from Sheikh Jassim a little bit then, because obviously that was the story of, you know, over the weekend, and from there we've seen sort of almost instantly afterwards, like you said, more. I can't really imagine it was a coincidence, the timing of, you know, Sheikh Jassim pulling out, and, you know, just a couple of hours later we see that Jim Ratcliffe's 25% offer seems to be not necessarily officially agreed, but certainly moving forward. Let's get into that offer then. So first of all, you mentioned already $1.7 billion, somewhere in that region, for the 25%. Firstly, is there any plans for how that money will be spent? Are we all just to assume that that's going into the Glazers' back pocket and that will never, be there to help Manchester United? Or, the structure of the announcement that they released in November or whenever it was financial. The way they phrased it suggested that some of that money could be used to help the club. Is that a potential? Have you heard anything about that? What are the Glazers going to do with this $1.7 billion?
Yeah, and what's Ratcliffe going to do as well? So the title, if you like, of Manchester United's one public release alluded to strategic investment. And therefore, if this is about cashing out, then what's the point of doing a process for strategic investment if you're all going to say, thank you very much, we're putting this money into our back pockets and very possibly the back pockets of some of the A shareholders as well, who are not the Glazers, and then move on? And that's the key question in all of this. How does Manchester United move forwards with or without the Glazers, and how quickly? Because it's all very well Ratcliffe coming in with sporting control, but if he doesn't have finances and if he doesn't have any flexibility over what he can do with the club because of his stake in the short term, then even with a long-term path to control, it's going to be difficult for Manchester United to move in the right direction. And when you look, just to make one side point, at Euro 2028, and Old Trafford not being one of those stadiums, that's staggering. Manchester United should have the best everything in the country, because even with this unloved period under the Glazers, they are still the biggest brand in world football and one of, if not the biggest club in world football. You can make arguments for Real Madrid, Barcelona, a few others, but I think it's almost a backhanded compliment to Manchester United that despite the start to the season, that despite the twists, the turns, the ups, the downs, the Glazers, Old Trafford, Carrington, and so on, despite everything that's happened pretty much since Sir Alex Ferguson, and many would say since the Glazers took charge, because they've saddled so much debt on the club, Manchester United is still there at the top of the brand charts, at the top of the Forbes valuations or close to it. And that tells you the kind of asset that Ratcliffe or anybody is looking to buy. So what will happen to the money? Well, some of it has to go back into the club. And how, I think, is the question. Are the Glazers effectively going to take that money and continue to saddle debt on the club? Are Ineos going to pay that money and then loan in order to further invest? And they've said that if they do that, short-term, medium-term or long-term, anything borrowed would be on Ineos's side rather than the club side. Or if that money isn't used, how else is capital going to be generated? Because remember, when Ratcliffe announced he wanted to buy Chelsea, he didn't say, I just want the club. He explicitly said, I've got the money to do the deal now, when Clearlake Bowley, the current Chelsea owners, were already in a period of exclusivity. And in doing so, he said Ineos could find 4 billion, 2.5 billion or so to buy Chelsea, and then around 1.7 billion to invest in the football club, which was a requirement from Roman Abramovich to protect the club and safeguard his legacy. So now Ratcliffe's only paying, I say only, but in the context of those numbers, 1.4 billion. Where's the rest of the money that when he needed it for 50% of Manchester United or 69% of Manchester United or 100% of Chelsea? Where's the rest of that money? Because it's clearly been allocated on the project. So paying less up front, is he going to inject any other capital into the club? And I think that whatever happens, whether it comes from the 1.4, whether it comes from further down the line, any kind of Ineos loans, or whether it comes from investment, some kind of urgent, in addition, investment will also happen. So we don't have clarity as to whether from the 25%, the Glazers, I don't think this word has ever been used, by the way, in the same sentence as Glazers, but I'm going to do it anyway. So brace yourselves, sit down, maybe take a deep breath. Whether or not it's the Glazers being selfless, dare I say, and taking all of that or most of that or some of that 25% and putting it back into the club, or whether it comes elsewhere, I think either way there will be direct investment into the club because of Jim Ratcliffe. And he's not going to buy an asset like Manchester United and just let it rot. He's no idiot. He's going to enter into Manchester United with a plan in the short, the medium and the long term. And obviously what's alarming to Manchester United fans is even if 100% of the 1.4 billion got spent, It's still not enough to redevelop Old Trafford. And if you redevelop Old Trafford with all of that money, it's not enough for Carrington. It's not enough to fund the men's team, the women's team, and the academy. It's not enough to potentially clear any outstanding transfer fees owed, and it's not enough to address the debt. So people are struggling to make the maths work, which is why, talking to sources, I think what is likely to happen is that a proportion of the money will be invested into the club, and a proportion will naturally go to shareholders, whether the Glazers or whether A shareholders. And if it's any A shareholders, they're obviously not going to cash out and then say, have the money back somehow in some strange, legally bizarre agreement. They're going to say, we've chosen to cash out at probably $40 a share. And as a result, we've given up that stock to Ratcliffe, and we've left the club, and we've done so at a premium. So clearly not all of this 1.4 billion or so can go back into the football club if A shareholders that are not the Glazers are involved in any capacity, and that is one possibility. But I think that what will happen is that Jim Ratcliffe will take 25% of the club in a structure and also consider what's known as preferred stock. And that's significant because it's different to just buying a traditional stake of 25%. And was he to consider doing a deal where he takes 25% and some preferred stock, then the latter would generate equity or capital for the football club, and that would be directly invested into all of the projects that are necessary.
Just as someone who doesn't know and hasn't even really heard the term preferred stock or preferred equity before, can you give me a bit more information on what that would mean? Because we were chatting just quickly before we went live, and you did mention this idea of a deal for preferred equity. What is that? What would that look like? And sort of explain it to me like the idiot I am, please.
Well, it's difficult because it can come in different forms and you can get relatively creative with it. But effectively, preferred stock would be a component of share capital that has a series of features that are not in common stock. And some of those properties are equity. Some of those properties can be put towards debt. So it's kind of a hybrid means of investment that can give somebody a preference in dividends. It can give them a preference in assets in the event of liquidation. And crucially, I think anyway, it has the option further down the line to convert into common stock, which might be part of the path to control. So when you look at that, plus the fact that preferred equity sometimes gives a higher yield of dividends, it might be an interesting route for Ratcliffe to explore. And by giving the owner of preferred shares a priority claim whenever a company pays dividends, that might be a smart route for Ratcliffe to actually commercialize his investment as well. But even though there's no hard and fast rule with aspects of this, I think that if a hybrid model was created whereby Ratcliffe bought 25% of shares and bought X amount of preferred stock, it would be categorically clear that any capital raised from the latter would be put directly back into the club from Ratcliffe. So that would not be about buying more from the Glazers. That would be about coming up with a hybrid model of equity and maybe debt related as well, because preferred stock can be an instrument for debt restructuring too. So this would be, and again, I'm really not explaining it in legal or financial terms, but this would be about getting creative and moving things around to find capital within a deal whilst giving Ratcliffe long-term options and preference.
Great. I think I know more. I certainly know more than I did before we had this conversation. Just a couple more questions just on Jim Ratcliffe generally, because we've seen, I think, a lot of people who, obviously preferred the Qatari bid or don't like Jim Ratcliffe or whatever. Just a couple of basic questions on him. As far as you're aware, is he a Manchester United fan? Did he grow up a Manchester United? That seemed to be a sort of understood, accepted thing about him 2 or 3 years ago, whereas now that's being called into question because the whole Chelsea debacle. Is he a United fan?
Yeah, I mean, when it was Chelsea he was looking for, he was an avid attender of Chelsea games, and when it's Manchester United he's a boyhood Manchester United fan. My understanding is that Ratcliffe is a businessman first and foremost, but does indeed have that childhood affinity with Manchester United. So for the purposes of coming into Manchester United, yes, he's a Manchester United fan. But if you put him under a lie detector test, if you like, and said, how much of a Manchester United fan are you? Or are you just a football fan? Or have you changed your allegiances over time? Then who knows how he would answer. I don't think that he's necessarily walking around his house wearing a Manchester United shirt. I don't think that he's necessarily got posters up on the wall or anything like that. But it is absolutely true to my knowledge that he's had an affinity with Manchester United Football Club since childhood. Yes, Chelsea complicates that, but that doesn't mean that he's not coming back to his roots. But I think also what's as important is that Ratcliffe says and is genuine in this, that he's got an affinity with Manchester as a city. So this, again, much like Jassim, is about what may benefit the club and the city of Manchester too. So community programs are going to be a part of Jim Ratcliffe's thinking as well. The other thing I'd say about Ratcliffe that I think is more important than the team he supports or even the structure of the bid is that this for Ratcliffe is about legacy, which is going to massively benefit, I think, Manchester United. Jim Ratcliffe, even though this is an Ineos bid, and even though there are other significant people who will be involved, like Jean-Claude Blanc, who has very recently joined Ineos from PSG as their CEO of sport, and Dave Brailsford, who's the director of sport, people like that will be very involved. But this is Ratcliffe driven, and he wants to be hands-on and day-to-day for legacy, almost for ego. And I don't mean ego in a bad way, because you could argue the Glazers are narcissistic, but that doesn't mean that they've ever engaged with the fan base. That doesn't mean that they turn up regularly to games, barring the odd cup final. That doesn't mean that they shout and scream and boast about the club. The narcissism, great, we're going to make loads of money. We're not going to invest money. We're going to borrow money. We're going to saddle debt on the club. And then we're going to boast about it at dinner parties. We're going to be there if any trophies are lifted. We're going to say thank you very much if we can make money from the club. Whereas for Ratcliffe, it's more, I think, comparable with Amanda Staveley at Newcastle, who, again, is not the majority owner, but has become kind of the face and voice of the football club, even though she only owns 10%. And that's Ratcliffe all over. If he possibly can, he wants to be in that dressing room taking that post-match photo. He wants to be there week on week. So even if those that are doubtful about him being a Manchester United fan are not convinced now, let's wait and see if he's successful. I think he'll be there for virtually every single game of the season, home and away. This is about Ratcliffe in his 70s wanting something globally massive that he can succeed with, which is why he wants sporting control immediately. So anyone that thinks he's a sucker, anyone that thinks he's overpaying, I think doesn't understand the kind of expert negotiator that Ratcliffe is. And that vanity element, that ego, will be different to the Glazers' narcissism and ego, because it will be present and it will be transparent. That might not mean everybody likes him, but he'll be there to be liked or disliked. He'll be there to engage. And I think that transparency will be very important. Right now, it's easy for journalists to report that. And the harder part is prove it. Engage with the supporters' trust. Turn up. Explain the bid. Explain the short, medium, long-term plans. Let's see whether he does that. But prior to the NDA and this bid starting, when Ratcliffe wanted Manchester United, he was very vocal. He spoke publicly. He went to the media. I expect that to continue. So like Ratcliffe or loathe Ratcliffe, think he's a Manchester United fan or not think he's a Manchester United fan, I expect him to be present and hands-on, because he sees this as not just business defining and financially viable or a bit of fun. he sees this as legacy defining and life defining. And personally, I think that can only benefit Manchester United.
Yeah, I do think that is, I'm glad that you've pointed that out and sort of reassured me with that, because that is a much more, a driving factor that could lead to success a lot more than the Glazers, like you said, which is just, we got handed this club by our dad, and if it makes us a bit of profit, then great. That isn't the motivation of, I want this to be the thing I'm remembered for. Reviving Manchester United, succeeding at Manchester United is a much more comforting motivator to me as a United fan than what we've seen with the Glazers. Just finally, obviously we've heard this thing that Jim Ratcliffe wants sort of sporting control at the club. How is that possible, obviously, other than a verbal agreement when the Glazers own more than him? And, how could that work? And would that mean that he can ignore the Glazers' wills, or more a case of, we promise we won't stick our nose in, assuming you're doing the right thing? Because they own more than him together, but yet could they legally hand over that control, or would it be a sort of an agreed control of the sporting side?
I think the sporting control is very interesting. As you say, if the Glazers were to maintain their position and voting rights, and we're speaking speculatively now, then what happens if there's a disagreement? If the Glazers control the brand and Ratcliffe controls the football, then again, how exactly does that work? And what happens when they run into a disagreement? And there's always overlap between the brand and the football side. What if the brand wants to go for a pre-season tour in Asia and the football department say that's not beneficial? What if the brand want to sign a flagship player because they think that it's going to have an effect and raise the value, and the football side say that's not right for us? How does the board become restructured under Ratcliffe? Does he join the board? Do more people on the Ratcliffe side join the board? If A shares are bought, does an A shareholder leave the board? Do they add members to the board? Do they keep it an even number, which I think is likely? Does Ratcliffe become co-chairman of the board? So if 6 Glazers vote one way, then he can potentially be part of breaking a tie. But then you might have Joel or Avram and Sir Jim Ratcliffe as co-chairman, and suddenly you're in the same position as you were before. So unfortunately, structurally, how you get legal sporting control presents more questions than answers. But once again, Ratcliffe's no idiot. He's not going to enter into something written on the back of a napkin that's a verbal gentleman's agreement. There will be something binding that gives Ratcliffe the control that he needs in order to recruit and then manage. And I think if Ratcliffe's able to recruit his own people, then from there it will be easier to manage anyway and restructure the club. But how quickly he can do that is also really important, I think, to have explained. So sporting control is an interesting one. It sounds good and reassuring, but as you correctly say, legally the structure will have to allow for that. And I'm not in a position to really answer definitively because there's just too many structures on the table. So first we need to determine what happens to the B shares. Because when Ratcliffe originally pivoted from 69% to 50.01% to get a majority stake and control of the club, it was contingent that that stake didn't still allow any remaining Glazers or all remaining Glazers with diluted shares to have the voting power. Because the stake's irrelevant if the Class B voting power still gives the Glazers control. So under that scenario, there was no current Class B voting power. But now he's only at 25%. We need to understand that there's lots of different permutations, which is why it's taken so much time. One permutation is that Ratcliffe still buys 25% of Glazers' B shares, but then the A shareholders are going to go absolutely nuts. And then if only 25% of B shares is bought, do they alter the articles of amendment in order to somehow allow, with approval, Ratcliffe B power, which I think is farcical and ridiculous and unfeasible and probably not legally sound, but we should outline it. You have hybrid structural scenarios too. So I think when we come back to sporting say, first of all, we have to understand actual legal say. What is Ratcliffe getting for his 25%? And how does the voting structure, if at all, change at the club? Because once we understand that, we will understand whether sporting control comes with a bit more voting power or whether it's business as usual. And to give people just a bit of broad insight without going into too many legalities, the reason why I'm being vague on the structure is because there's all manner of scenarios. So if I give you 3 brief scenarios, you'll start to understand why there's been so much debate. And these are not the only scenarios either. But one scenario might be Ratcliffe buys 25% of the Glazers' existing shares, and there'd be no change to the A and B structure. And that would leave the Glazers with around 44%, but they would still have almost 90% of the voting power. So that's not going to be good for sporting control for Ratcliffe. And I don't think personally that option's feasible. Second type of option is that Ratcliffe could inject his 1.4 billion into the club in new equity to get his 25% stake in what's known as the pro forma entity. And again, there would be no change to the A and B structure. I'm sure with that scenario, I'm losing people, but new equity would be desperately needed at the club. And it would be less likely under that scenario that the money would all just go into the Glazers' back pockets. He would get around 5% of voting rights, though, in that scenario. So it's also probably not going to be beneficial as far as Ratcliffe is concerned. And then you have a third scenario, which is more of a hybrid structure. And under a hybrid structure, we would likely see Jim Ratcliffe buying an equal percentage of A and B shares in a hybrid format. So some will tell you that is 12.5 and 12.5, but remember, that's not equal. That's not an impossible option, but that would be heavily weighted towards the A shareholders. So they might like it because it would give about 4 in 10 the opportunity to try and cash out, but the Glazers would actually get less if you split it 12.5 and 12.5. Why? Because it's 12.5 of B shares coming from 69, and it's 12.5 out of 31 from the A shares. So actually, the more logical scenario is to do it pro rata in a hybrid model, which means that you would take 25% from 69 and 25% from 31 to get to your overall 25. And that would pacify the A shareholders. And obviously, the Glazers, off the top of my head, would get about 17 or 18% of the total 25 if A shareholders are included and eligible. And then it gets complicated because this process was meant to only be about the Glazers' shares. Everything's the complicated bit.
Yeah.
Grouped together in one structure, because this is supposed to be about Glazers' shares and strategic investment. So if you involve non-Glazers in order to pacify them and avoid litigation, then it's separate legalities, it's separate paperwork, it's a separate, potentially almost tender process. Some might get it, some might miss out, some could be approached if they're the bigger ones, some could feel entirely left out. There's just too many permutations. But look, in essence, that hybrid model feels to me like the only realistic solution that a board would approve. And then we need to understand, as you say, where the money's going and what happens to the structure of the club to give Ratcliffe enough say that if he runs into trouble regarding sporting control, he's got some kind of legal fallback.
I mean, I tell you what, I'm glad it's not me having to draw up these contracts and these deals, because I would be absolutely clueless. Luckily, we've got probably some of the best lawyers in the world putting all this together, and hopefully, you know, maybe there's a chance that Jim Ratcliffe takes over sporting control, that if there's a small backward step in performances or whatever, do the Glazers then go, actually, we're going to take back control? Like, that all has to be worked out. And like I said, you know, I'm glad it's not me. I said that was the last question. This is the last one. Keep it as brief as possible. Just your opinion based on what you've seen in the past, what you know of the Glazers and of Ratcliffe and of your sources. Medium to long term, do you see Jim Ratcliffe owning 51% or more of Manchester United?
Yeah, my personal opinion is that logically, Ratcliffe's not going to enter into something that he won't eventually control. Okay. I doubt that's going to be 100%. So I think that if you start at 25%, your next step up, it may not be the final step up, but your next step up would logically be to go from 25 to 50.01. and then you've got a majority stake and control of the club. And then if the Class B voting power collapses and changes as part of all of this, he will ultimately have control. The A shareholders will be pacified, and then there may be a route to taking more. If you're Ratcliffe and somehow, I can't work out how legally, but if terms were changed and Ratcliffe got Class B voting power, he wouldn't necessarily need that much in order to have voting control over the club. But we're speaking hypothetically. So I think that the model here will be like 49ers Enterprises and Leeds United. It will be a staggered approach to a majority stake and control. But the difference is, my understanding with 49ers Enterprises and Leeds is that even though they got it over the course of last summer, they had a binding commitment to take it come what may by 2024. So it really comes back to that first point that we made, because fans are going to feel a bit calmer if in 3 to 5 years Ratcliffe is either obligated to buy or the Glazers are obligated to sell at different junctures. But if it's optional, then who's to say that Ratcliffe doesn't get cold feet? Who's to say things don't go according to plan? Who's to say that the Glazers don't decide they want to stay? Who's to say it doesn't all blow over and then the club gets put on the market at a different point, and then even Ratcliffe ends up being forced to flip it or deciding to flip it? There's unfortunately too many variables. So I don't think that a path to control with the word option in it is good enough in terms of clarity and in terms of Manchester United fans being on board. But I think if there is an obligation, if there's a final end to the Glazers, even if it's in 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, I think that's more acceptable, because then fans will start to realise that maybe Ratcliffe had to take this approach in order to win. And maybe that's also why Qatar couldn't win. And if it still ends with the Glazers leaving, then okay, it's not a takeover today or tomorrow, but it is a takeover. It is the Glazers out. It's just a case of staggered rather than immediate. But if that word option is used, then personally, I think that Ratcliffe is going to be entering into a very hostile environment and is not only going to have to work out how to get Manchester United to win on the field and quickly, but is also going to have to work out how to engage with the fan base and win them over as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we need that, like you said, that word obligation to be in there. And hopefully we'll find out more in the next few days. But thank you so much, Ben, for coming on and explaining all of that. Some of which I got and has reassured me a little bit. Some of which, I'll be honest, I did struggle a little bit with some of the options in there. But I think anyone watching will have learned a lot more than they did at the start. So thank you once again, Ben Jacobs, sports broadcaster, for coming on to the channel.
Yeah, my pleasure. Even I don't understand half the things I say as well, so you're not alone.
Cheers. Right, that's going to be all from us. Make sure you hit the subscribe button if you haven't already, and we'll see you in a bit.